Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us tonight for this special event to launch this book by Greg Melleuish, Australian Intellectuals, Their Strange History and Pathological Tendencies. Australia is sort of meant to be an anti-intellectual society, so I suppose the fact there's so many here is you're curious as to see what one looks like. I'm delighted that Peter Coleman has agreed to launch the book tonight. I said it to Peter just a few moments ago that whilst we've known each other for a long time, the first time I ever heard Peter was at Sydney University when at an orientation day debate. Now I'm talking about 1968, and he was debating the criminologist Gordon Hawkins on censorship. Now I have no idea who won and who was on each side. When you're 18 years of age, you don't think of things like that, I guess. But then Barry Maley, who was standing beside us, trumped us both. He said, well, we've known each other since before I was born. So there we go. So Peter and Barry go back a long way. Peter, as you know, has been a part of Australia's, and particularly Sydney's, intellectual life for a long time. He was the editor of the Bulletin from 64 to 67 and of Quadrant for over 20 years. He had a distinguished career as a member of the New South Wales Parliament from 68 to 78, serving both as a minister and leader of the opposition. In 1979, he was appointed administrator for Norfolk Island. He was then member for Wentworth from 81 to 86, and he's been busy ever since. Greg Melleuish, who's the author of the book to be released tonight, or launched tonight, has taught European history at the University of Melbourne, Australian studies at the University of Queensland, and now teaches Australian politics, political theory, and European and world history at the University of Wollongong. He's published widely in the area of Australian political ideas and intellectual history. His books include Cultural Liberalism in Australia, The Power of Ideas, essays on Australian history and politics, as well as numerous articles. He was served as CIS's he was the editor of CIS's magazine Policy last year, and his latest book is the one we're talking about tonight. Peter will talk for maybe 10 minutes, then Greg for however long it takes, and there'll be some Q&A if you wish, but now it's my pleasure to welcome Peter Coleman.
Thank you, Greg, ladies and gentlemen. I've been told to be brief. This is not a seminar, it's a party to celebrate Greg's remarkable and rich Australian intellectuals, their strange history and pathological tendencies. So let me just quickly make three quick points. The first deals with Greg's perspective on Australian history. Most of us absorb the idea somewhere or other at school or university or wherever that the great formative defining period in our history was at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, the age of the offensively Australian legend, the ideology of mateship, the Bulletin, Henry Lawson, the Labor Party, Federation. Greg sees this as a period when the rot set in. It's not the defining period, but the bad period. As he reads our history, we had in the 19th century a leaven of liberal lawyers and politicians, editors and writers, clerics and teachers, whose work and thought in books and essays, sermons and newspapers and magazines were superior to anything produced in the 20th century, or almost anything. It was also, by the way, the most prosperous period in our history. But by the turn of the century, a new breed, this is as Greg sees it, and I go along with him a long way, at the turn of the century, a new breed of illiberal, adversarial publicists, the intellectuals, inspired, sometimes intoxicated, by abstract ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity and social justice, was beginning to encroach on liberal institutions and create its own radical establishment. The issue was, as it were, between the Bulletin and the Sydney Morning Herald, or radicals and conservatives, with the radicals usually triumphing, at least in cultural life. Greg thinks, in other words, he doesn't say this, but this is what it comes down to, that Donald Horne's lucky country got it entirely wrong. Donald's idea was that Australia is and always has been a second-rate country run by second-rate leaders, businessmen and politicians who got away with it by luck. Greg's view is that Australia in the 19th century used to be a first-rate country run by first-rate leaders, businessmen and politicians who did not rely on luck but on enterprise, good laws and hard work. But by the turn of the century they were supplanted by second-rate socialists and intellectuals who presided over a decline in Australia. They were the ones who relied on luck. And not to put too fine a point on it, I think Greg means the Labor Party. But after decades of ruin, there has been a revival of good sense. Greg draws hope from the success of such institutions as the Centre for Independent Studies, the Institute of Public Affairs and Quadrant, and their associated ideas. We are now at the tipping point, with relics of the century of ruin all around us, but signs of revival as well. We could go either way. It's up to us. The second quick point I'd like to make is refer to Greg's case study of intellectuals, not generalisations about intellectuals at large, but a case study of historians. He is a professional historian and has many lively observations to report about the profession. So I'll be selective. One of the best ways, he points out, for an historian to seek preferment, particularly if he's an historian of Australia, has been to absorb the teachings of Michel Foucault, Edward Said and the radical feminists. Once you learn to toe this party line, you will readily be received into the black armband cult of Australian history. Your career will be assured. In due course you may assume the mantle of the prophet and denounce your fellow countrymen as moral pygmies, genocidalists, neo-Nazis or worse. But there's a problem. Students no longer enrol in your courses. Why, Greg asked, should they submit to indoctrination in politicised, his words, politicised garbage disguised as history? No wonder the study of ancient civilisations of ancient Rome or Greece, free of political agenda, is so popular among young historians, especially, he says, in New South Wales. This is a good sign. The great hope, Greg says, is to be found among young people who no longer toe the line. Now, the third point I want to mention quickly is Greg's epilogue, his alternate vision, as he puts it. The task before us is to develop an alternative program for, quote, those who wish to escape the clutches of the tyranny of left hegemony. We need a canon of the best that has been thought and written about the human condition and Western civilization. He's making a high appeal, and into which all students should be initiated. It will include Homer and Virgil, Dante and Goethe, Shakespeare and Milton. He sees light still flickering in some of the older academies, but also in the new ones such as Campion College and Old Toongabbie. I think, ladies and gentlemen, that Greg has summed up for us what has gone wrong and how to fix it. You won't agree with everything he says, but I'm sure you will agree it is a brilliant and important little book. More than a straw in the wind, it is a lively beacon of light. So thank you, Greg, and congratulations. It is with great pleasure and some relief that I launch, relief because at last it's being said, relief that I launch Australian Intellectuals, Their Strange History and Pathological Tendencies.
I've been told that I have to be academic tonight, but my opening gambit is that when I first thought about what I would say tonight, I was sitting and having lunch at Dapto Leagues Club. Actually, I was having crumb cutlets, and I think that somehow crumb cutlets is a way of dividing old and new Australia. They're very hard to get in Annandale, I think, but very easy to get in country clubs, which is something to say. And that tells you that I don't live in Annandale or a Fitzroy ghetto, so I'm not part of the club. But I'm probably an intellectual, but I'm an outsider who's never been a member of the club, which perhaps provides me with a certain detachment. And I've spent most of my professional life studying intellectuals, particularly intellectual history, so I have a fair idea of the ins and outs of what it means to be an intellectual. Having said that, I will also say that the term intellectual to me is a very annoying term. It's one of those words that traditionally has not been popular in the Anglosphere. A bit like the way government has been preferred to the European term of the state in English-speaking countries. So English-speaking countries are a bit uneasy, like I am, with the term intellectual. I think the reason for this is that intellectual is largely a continental European phenomenon. Like the philosophes of the French Enlightenment, that's a term that in the Anglosphere has not been a term that people prefer to use. And traditionally, I think there's been a more organic relationship existing between those who had ideas and the wider population in the English-speaking world. And I think that England and Australia didn't have intellectuals for quite some time. And there's a number of reasons for this. One was that as an aristocratic society, England was happy to patronise men of ideas and make use of them. They could become insiders, unlike in France, where they were outsiders constantly criticising the status quo. And I also think there's a powerful streak of opposition to abstract ideas amongst English thinkers, starting with the Cambridge Platonists, to David Hume, Edmund Burke, Matthew Arnold and Michael Oakeshott. Practice was given priority over theory. And I think that's important. And the same, as I say in the book, is actually true in Australia, at least initially. If you look at mid-19th century Australia, it's actually quite hard to find intellectuals. There are just people who had ideas about their world. When I started working on this period many, many years ago, I used the term littérateurs to describe individuals such as Daniel Dennehy, because I saw them more as literary figures rather than intellectuals. If you look at an important Australian colonial politician like Sir Henry Parkes, if you read his speeches, you'll discover he had an extremely powerful mind, but he was not an intellectual. He was concerned with the practice of ways of doing things. Nevertheless, even starting from the middle of the 19th century, I think we can see that there's always been a tension between what could be termed the thinking classes, those who are interested in ideas, and the wider population. And one can see this when looking at something, for example, like the establishment of universities in Australia. There's always been a tension. There always will be a bit of a tension. And the reason for that, I think, is going back to Plato's cave. If you know the cave in the Republic, the people who have been enlightened, seen the light, they go out and see the light. And there's a difference between those who have seen the light and those who are still in darkness. And there is always going to be a tension there, I think. But nevertheless, educated men of the 19th century understood they had a public duty. And this has remained true for some down to this day. So there has been a continuing tradition of people who've been educated, who've contributed to public life. That's always been there. And it was particularly strong in the 19th century, I think. The linkage between people who were educated, people who had ideas, and the wider population was much more organic, I think, during the 19th century. So when did the breach occur? When did some sort of breach occur between intellectuals and perhaps the wider population? As Peter said, I argue in the book that the first adversarial culture in Australia arrives with the Bulletin. The Bulletin is opposed to ordinary, respectable society. It doesn't like a lot about contemporary society. It doesn't like respectability. It doesn't like all those bourgeois and liberal virtues that had been so cultivated in 19th century Australian society. But well into the 20th century in Australia, there were few professional thinkers. I think this is something which is interesting about Australian history, that in fact, if you look at the 19th century, there are a few people who just interested in ideas. And, for example, in the first half of the 20th century, there are very few university positions, for example, very few people who can get jobs as professors. Interestingly, and I think this says something about the nature of Australian society, the Commonwealth Public Service actually wasn't all that interested in employing graduates before the Second World War. It preferred ex-servicemen. And the literary world did not provide much of a living. Many Australian thinkers during this period actually became expatriates. There's a long history of expatriate thinkers leaving Australia, going to Britain, but also to America, and this happens right through to the 1960s. If there was an intellectual class in Australia in the first half of the 20th century, perhaps they were journalists more than anything else. You've just got to look at the groups that are there. And in a way, this explains Percy Stevenson's famous tirade about how the national culture in Australia needs to be more national. It's only really in the 1950s and the 1960s that this changes. It changes with the Whitlam generation. Now, I watched the first documentary the other night on Whitlam. Did everybody else see this great work of mythology and self-serving whatever? It was intriguing in many ways. The part I liked was when they said Gough captured the imagination of outer suburbanites, and the proof of this was Don's Party. Which I thought was an intriguing way to prove something. Very, very, very strange logic in many ways. But it is true that in this period, from say the 50s through to the early 70s, there was an expansion of secondary education in the 1950s. I think Queensland in 1962 actually raised the school leaving age from 13. Which is an interesting comment on things. Apparently, before that time, the idea of education in Queensland's produced boys to go and work on the farms, which is a different idea to what we have today. So, expansion of secondary education, you can see this. I've actually had a look at, for example, at the number of schools that were set up in the late 1950s and the expansion of the leaving certificate and so on. Then there was the growth of public sector employment. The Commonwealth Public Service, which once didn't particularly want to employ too many graduates, expanded massively its graduate employment, particularly in the 60s. In fact, in the 60s, I can remember I was told that they didn't really want people didn't really want to go and live in Canberra, so they had to reclassify jobs upwards to get the graduates to go there in the 60s. It's an interesting thing. And I remember when I was in the public service in the 1970s, the place seemed to be full of people from Queensland. Maybe that said something about, maybe that said something about me or something. Maybe that's what I noticed. And then, of course, the growth of the media, especially the ABC. And I think it's under these circumstances that Australia begins to get something that looks like intellectuals. These intellectuals were attracted to abstract ideas. They felt themselves to be alienated from the wider society. They came to see themselves as separate from that wider society, perhaps as a place from which they had escaped, just as people escaped from Queensland by going to the public service. And they came to develop an adversary culture. And I think what I argue in the book is that as time went by, they've come to constitute a subculture within Australian society. I think that's important. They've come to constitute, and we have to understand something about how that subculture came into being. I paint broad brushes, but it would be a really interesting research project looking at the way that these subcultures actually come into being within the framework, the larger framework. Interestingly enough, the growth of the intellectuals in Australia happens alongside the decline of classical culture in Australia. In this regard, I think it's very worthwhile to go back and read John Anderson's essay on classicism that he wrote about 1960 on the virtues of classical. And I think what this means is, amongst other things, the erosion of traditional educated learning from the ancient languages to much English literature and to grammar. I now take classes in which you cannot explain grammar to students. They simply don't get it. They don't know the terminology of grammar. They don't know what verbs and nouns and clauses and all those things are. If you ask them to parse something, they look at you in a quizzical way. It's not part of their experience. So that's in practical terms, the decline of grammar, I think, is one of the measures of that. At the same time, I think, the new intellectual class are also the heirs of the nominalists as opposed to the realists of the 13th century. The argument in intellectual history circles these days is that modernity is no longer seen as perhaps something that comes out of the Enlightenment, but something which goes back to the 14th century. And it goes back to the differentiation between realists and nominalists. And the consequence of nominalism is the idea that there is no natural law, but the world is waiting to be made through human will. World is making, so there's not law that constrains people. We can make and remake the world through will. And the intellectuals of the late 20th century and the early 21st century want to make and remake the world in accordance with their abstract theories and models. And I think that's the foundation of their progressivism. Opposition to this progressivism, as I argue in the book, largely comes from what I would perhaps see as a classicist rump, who start with the world as it is and the concrete traditions that they have inherited. But the problem is that the new progressivist intellectuals have largely broken down those traditions and have no sense of order based on classical principles. And the problem is when these sorts of things are lost, it's very hard to bring them back. Once students and people don't know grammar, how do you then bring grammar back? How do you bring back traditional modes of learning? It's very, very difficult. It's because you don't have the people trained to be able to do this. So in the place of concrete traditions and a sense of order, we have, I think, abstract models that are driven by passions which do not have a rational basis, but are rooted in the adversary culture. If my analysis is on the right track, I think there are a number of considerable consequences. The first is we have intellectuals who are no longer attached to the traditions of learning upon which our world was built. We have intellectuals who are addicted to abstract models to which they give primacy as against the real world. They mistake their models for the world. I'm not opposed to models as such, but their limitations must be recognised. We have intellectuals who simply move from one set of ideas to the next as their fancy takes them. We have intellectuals who are increasingly alienated from the wider society of which they are part. And finally, we have intellectuals who have real problems integrating the cognitive and affective parts of their nature. They are so wrapped up in abstract ideas that they have problems separating out that part, the relationship between the two. And for me, the real issue is how do we restore the balance which has gone awry in a whole number of ways. And again, I address some of this in the book. One of this is that we need a new pluralism in our various educational and intellectual institutions. We need more private universities. We need a government that will enable private universities to come into being. We need other institutions. We need things like think tanks. We need, if the culture of the intellectuals in Australia is a form of subculture, then we need another form of culture able to combat it. We need to restore the balance in what we teach. In particular, this means teaching the traditions which constitute our civilization. We need to teach about Western civilization. We need students to know about what happened. We need them to be in touch with the best that has been thought and written. We need a genuine culture of learning, which emphasises the careful and sensible discussion of ideas and their consequences. The problem with many intellectuals is that they are not necessarily very well trained. And although we tend to think intellectuals must be bright, some of them are not necessarily A-grade material. You know, this is a reality. You know, some of them have got there through patronage and other ways. They're not necessarily the brightest people in the world. We need to look at the way we educate and train thinkers. It seems to me that our universities that use research via PhDs is a particularly lousy way of doing this. And perhaps some of the strangeness of contemporary academic and intellectual life can be put down to the sorts of training that they undergo through their PhDs, particularly in the humanities and social sciences. This sort of training can create very strange people. Very strange people. I mean, if you lock a person in a room for 3 years and get them to research a topic with limited contact with other people, then they're going to come out very odd. To think that this is the foundation on which we allow people to teach our students is even stranger. This may not be anything to do. And I came across this website after I'd written the book, and it's interesting that with PhD students, many drop out, many suffer depression, and it may be the case that those who are left standing are in fact scarred for life. There's something about social interaction and so on which doesn't take place. Research, I think, you know, everybody says research is a wonderful thing, we need more of it, but psychologically I'm not convinced that, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, that research is a very healthy form of lifestyle. Strangely enough, there may be ways of overcoming some of the negative things that happen. We need good thinkers. I'm not opposed to good thinkers. We need good thinkers. We don't need intellectuals. You know, people abstract ideas, but we are awfully careless, I think. We don't give much thought about the way that we get those thinkers. We don't think about, well, what's the best way of training someone? What's the best way of producing a well-rounded human being who can do research, who can do other things? What's the best way? These are technical matters, perhaps, but it's odd that these sorts of matters rarely get discussed. So, having said all that, I would like to thank Greg very much for hosting this launch. I enjoy very much the time that I spent editing policy and looking at the alternative to some of the ways in which things are done in our universities. I'd also like very much to thank Connor Court, and in particular Anthony Capella, for his faith in publishing the book. I had an email from Gary Johns saying, you know, Connor Court is the publisher that is in fact doing so much in our intellectual life. And not only that, but if you know Anthony, you'll know that he is the paradigm of the small businessman creating a profitable business through hard work. And I think that's really, really, really great that we have publishers like that. And by ending, I just end with a little a little story, just to horrify Peter perhaps. I applied for some money. I'm writing a book on James Macaulay. I've been writing for quite some time for Connor Court, and I applied for some money from the university to perhaps give me a bit of teaching relief to help me do this. And it was knocked back. And I was told that one of the reasons why it was knocked back, because really James Macaulay is not really an important topic for study in the 21st century. So that tells you something about what Australian universities are about. So I'll finish there.